So welcome everybody to our book salon in honor of the publication of Mara de Gennaro's book, Modernism After Postcolonialism Toward a Non-Territorial Comparative Literature. I'm Laura Lomas. I'm a professor in the English department at Rutgers University, Newark. And I want to extend a special thank you to the Center for European Studies, the Program in American Studies, and Ideas and Futures for hosting this. It really is essential to have a platform in which to express ideas. I also want to thank Alexa Chang for her co-sponsorship and help in making this event happen. Mara de Gennaro teaches interdisciplinary global studies and critical writing in the MA program at New York University, Gallatin School of Individualized Study. She specializes in Anglophone and Francophone literatures, transnational and comparative modernisms, postcolonial studies, and Caribbean studies. She's the author of Modernism After Postcolonialism, the book that we're celebrating today. While writing this book, she was a visiting fellow at the Committee on Globalization and Social Change at the CUNY Graduate Center and a visiting scholar at Columbia's Institute for Comparative Literature and Society. Welcome, Atto. It's great to see you.
Great to see you.
Atto Quayson is the Morris M. and Jean G. Doyle Professor of Interdisciplinary Studies at Stanford University and is currently chair of the English department. He's published widely on postcolonial studies, African literature, disability studies, diaspora studies, and urban studies, among others. His most recent book is Tragedy and Postcolonial Literature, published by Cambridge in 2021. He's an elected fellow of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Royal Academy of Canada, and the British Academy. I'm going to invite Sadia Abbas just to say a few words about Ideas and Futures, which is the platform that is hosting us, so that our students will become aware of this platform as an amazing resource and supplement to our institutions.
Thank you, Laura. Hello, everybody. I recognize at least one of my students by name in the audience. Welcome, Atto and Mara. It's a delight to be here. I should say that although we will be hosting you as a recording, it's not going out right now live through Ideas and Futures, right? We don't yet do that, but we will hopefully do that in the future as well. What the platform does offer is a kind of global dissemination and international presence, and we are explicitly internationalist. If you look at, and I think you can put it in the link in the chat as well, Laura, is that what we are hoping to do and what we like to do is disrupt a little bit the sense in the public domain in the United States, and it's a model that has been exported elsewhere as well, that people somehow are incapable of or unappreciative of complex thinking, and that they don't want access, right? So there's a kind of push through neoliberalism to commoditize thinking in such a way, and then it's always about, well, you've got to be accessible, and in order to be accessible, you've got to be hypersimplified. We don't believe that, and so far we've been doing pretty well, right? So what we believe is that we're all thinking people, and that complex thinking and long form is a good thing. At the same time, we've got a very serious political presence as well, and we do a lot of work on with activists and put them, sort of to showcase their work. And we'll be putting up in the next couple of weeks conversations with Palestinian activists on the West Bank, conversations, videos of the effect on labor in Lahore of the coronavirus pandemic, a video of the effect on homeless people and sex workers in Athens of the coronavirus, and a reflection by one of Pakistan's greatest feminist left-wing poets, Fehmi Riaz, who died recently, of on one of Pakistan's great artists who's was displaced from India in the early 70s, from North India. And so Camila Raz wrote this beautiful meditation about it, which will also be published. And we do welcome scholarly reflections as well, written ones, and we are always happy to put stuff up on our platform, as long as it has some sort of a solid component. We're also a nonprofit at this point. So it's called Ideas and Futures, a collaborative for just and vibrant societies, with a very intense group of people. So we're always happy to help collaborations happen across the world and across disciplines and across genres. And the other thing is that we're multimedia, we're multidisciplinary, and we observe no prohibitions. So except for ones on probably bad neoliberal austerity thinking, but that's about it. So welcome, and we're very happy to be part of this. And thank you, Laura, for doing this. I'm now going to put off my video and listen. So.
Yeah, well, this is actually the ideal forum then, because in many ways, Mara's book is precisely about the need for complex and subtle thinking. But aside from celebrating the achievement that the book represents, I just want to give a little back story on what I was thinking of in proposing this book salon at Rutgers as part of our English department's reflections on its role at a public university, which has been celebrating the fact that it is recognized by US News and World Report as the most diverse for the past 2 decades in the United States. Our department, like others, has begun to consider the need to change our name to bring it more in line with what we do, both as students, our students and the scholars in the department, and the creative writers. And we're asking what comparative and global approaches to the literary might make sense in our context. Because many of our students draw upon more than one language, certainly, and more than one cultural context, more than one national framework. I wanted to mention that another agenda for me, because this is also initiated as a resource for my students of literary theory, we've been reflecting on precisely on the subtopic of our presentation, that is to say, transdisciplinary and transnational approaches. I know that, Otto, that's a specialty of yours, and it really is showcased in Mara's volume. Sort of how the book addresses the exhaustion of a certain version of high theory in which we were trained. I mean, I was fortunate to be one of Mara's in the same institutional context when she was a star student of Spivak and Edward Said, the founders of postcolonial theory. So the book in a way stands as an homage to the critical postcolonial departure from a Eurocentric modernist canon, and delivers us, her readers, elsewhere, as she says. It's an elsewhere she defines as an inchoate, shifting, non-territorial literature. And so we're really interested to hear what she means by that. This other comparative literature, specifically comparisons marked by uncertainty, inconsonance, and unease, as she says, shows us a way out of inherited imperial assumptions of period, nation, and empire, and monolingualism, and directs us instead toward a literary theory of relevance to the global frameworks and forms of statelessness in which many live in the 21st century, perhaps especially in our university, where the majority of students live across cultural borders and languages and feel displaced or even invisible in courses that retain unreconstructed frameworks of study, such as the name of our department, English and American Literature. Having studied in the 90s, Mara has written a book that carefully and closely reads form in a range of theoretical and literary texts, and proposes that the form of difficult text qualifies or contradicts the manifest content and ostensible cultural politics of canonical modernist texts. I'm glad that the book's title, and this is really in response to a specific question that she asked me in another context about the title, because I really rooted for modernism after postcolonialism, which grapples with the inability to master the world. What we might read is the salutary sign of the unraveling of several centuries of European and Euro-American imperial violence and imposition. I am glad that the book's title decenters the anxious masters and directs our attention instead to the theoretical force of what Simon Gikandi calls modernism in the world. This world of, quote, unpredictable generative relations, unquote, illuminates what escapes the language of cultural imperialism, and indeed, of, quote, what one has always been. Here, the one in question refers to a unity of national linguistic singularity, a force that has long informed nation-based literary study, and centering the comparative impulse of theoretical projects of Martinique and Edouard Glissant, of Françoise Verchès, of literary texts by Coetzee, Edwidge Danticat, and many others. This elegant book performs new directions in transnational and interdisciplinary criticism in a way that I find particularly relevant for our historical moment and for my institutional location in Newark. So we will proceed first with Mara de Gennaro presenting her thoughts on our title, Toward a Non-Territorial Comparative Literature, and then Anto Quayson will offer a response. And then I invite those in attendance, including my students and colleagues, to pose questions in the Q&A, or if you want to speak, I can give you an opportunity to speak on our recording. So please do interact with me in the Q&A. Thank you, Mara, for being here.
Thank you, Laura. That was wonderful. And I just want to say I am so grateful and honored to be here and to have been invited to the Ideas and Futures Forum, which I've been reading for some time. I tried to remember the exact date I learned of it. I think it was over a year ago, but it's a really exciting forum in which there are videos and there are poems and there are just all kinds of great diverse perspectives represented. And so in reading it and viewing talks from it before, I never imagined that I would be invited, at least so soon, or at all, to address you. So it's really a thrill. I too want to thank the co-sponsors of the event, the Center for European Studies at New Brunswick and the American Studies program at Newark. And I want to thank Sadia Abbas for being so welcoming and warm. And I want to thank my dear friend and indispensable interlocutor, Laura Lomas, who was indeed instrumental in choosing this title. The book had been called, I had called it Modernism After Postcolonialism for a long time, but I hadn't decided and I'd considered other things. And she made a strong case, and she also just added to her case here in a really interesting way. And so I wrote that down, Laura, and I think you've persuaded me that it was the right title. I think that was what was needed. And it's really a special honor for me to be here with Otto Quayson, who has just been a source of inspiration to me since I first met him in a job interview, actually, years ago for a job in Caribbean studies, and it was a job I did not get, but I got to know him, and that was better, actually. And he contributed a beautiful blurb to the book, and just the support that he's offered, as well as his inspiring example as a brilliant and humane academic, really has been important to me. So I'm really thrilled to be here with all of you and to have Otto as my respondent and Laura as the moderator. It's just really very exciting for me. So I'm going to read this from my screen, and that means I can't really look at you, but I think that will be clearer. Laura, you can stop me if or tell me to slow down, or if I'm going too fast. Okay. So the Martinican novelist and theorist of créolité, Patrick Chamoiseau, wrote recently in his book, Migrant Brothers, any one of us can, in the wake of a fire, a tornado, a tectonic fury, a job loss, be forced to leave home and ask for asylum. In light of this, he writes, the poets declare that never again will anyone on this planet have to set foot on a foreign land. Every land will be native to all, nor will anyone remain in the margins of citizenship, every citizenship conferring its graces on all. Now, I use this passage as the book's epigraph because his designation of poets as the particular champions of a globally inclusive, non-territorial hospitality seemed to me to participate in a still ongoing transnationalist literary project dating back to the early 20th century, in which otherwise very disparate writers have sought to create, through poetic experimentation, a special language through which to overcome entrenched divides of one sort or another, and to convey an otherwise incommunicable experience or aspiration or ideal. This transnationalist literary project is the subject of my book, Modernism After Postcolonialism, Toward a Non-Territorial Comparative Literature. And crucial to the book is a focus on the centrality of productively difficult, unresolved, often irresolvable comparative forms to 20th century literary depictions of encounters with cultural and sexual difference, also to a lesser degree species difference. Variously but repeatedly, these innovative forms of comparison compete with speakers' habitually contrastive and hierarchizing assertions and hint at unrecognized and not yet existing relations obscured by preconceived boundaries around selves and others. Poetics in this context works to interrupt and challenge habituated ways of thinking, in part by calling attention to its own internal contradictions and impasses. I'd like to begin by reading a brief selection from the opening of my fourth and final chapter, which I picked partly in recognition of the earthquake last month in Haiti, as well as ongoing reports about Haitian migrants being repelled at the US border. Here's how chapter 4 opens. Within a month of the January 12, 2010 earthquake that left much of southern Haiti in ruins, Edwige Danticat returned to her native Port-au-Prince to find, amid homes and public buildings collapsed, piles of human remains freshly pulled from the rubble and appearing outside the city's general hospital to be stuck together in two large balls. She remembers her impulse to imagine these unrecognizable balls of flesh as the remnants of nursing and midwifery students clinging to each other in their final moments of shock and terror. But her friend John, a resident artist, explained otherwise. These are all body parts, he said, legs and arms that were pulled out of the rubble and placed on the side of the road, where they dried further and melded together. Danticat recounts this return to Haiti, her first since the earthquake, in an essay she calls Our Guernica, where interlaced images of a devastated landscape and the Haiti that came before are superimposed briefly but significantly on two other sites of communal devastation, a destroyed Hiroshima and the Basque town of Guernica, bombed in 1937 by Nazi Germany in support of Franco's nationalist campaign against the Spanish Republican government. She knows these sites through the visual arts. The destroyed Hiroshima, she remembers, is from an unspecified film she's seen, leaving us to compile the sources of our own mental images of Hiroshima, while the Guernica she contemplates with John is the one many of us know best. Misty-eyed, he whispers, like Picasso and Guernica after the Spanish Civil War, we will have our Guernica, or thousands of them, I concur. Coming to terms with an earthquake's aftermath by comparing it to wartime sites of catastrophic violence against civilians is, in a sense, not unlike imagining the prior compassion of living bodies now reduced to inanimate flesh. It directs us elsewhere, to another place and time, in the face of an overwhelming image of trauma in the present. Both are deflections of sorts, variations of what Bruce Robbins describes in an essay published the same year as Danticat's, the narratorial practice of looking away from large-scale historical violence, for instance, in the form of an aside about a character's future, at the very moment when that violence is unfolding most vividly and unbearably in the story. But while Danticat might allow her narrator and us some distraction from the scene's horrors when she reminds us of prior calamities that inspired art, or when she transforms disfigured corpses into people huddled together, mutually giving and taking comfort in the face of death, she does so by pressing on readers remote from Haiti a different sort of burden, the imperative to care about Haitian suffering because it resembles something they already care about or think they should. To reach this audience, Danticat incorporates into her essay's documentary description both a fleeting historical fiction, the imagined suffering of a few that encapsulates the suffering of Haiti's earthquake victims en masse, and a guiding analogy that links these few and the community they represent to other civilian casualties already deemed important on the world stage. I go on to develop the idea of analogies as a means of making do with inadequate resources denoting a scarcity not of locally meaningful evidence, but of the attention and sympathy of distant readers who could intervene if they only had the will to do so. The question becomes, I write in this, now I'm shifting back to the final part from this section. The question becomes, how might the writer seduce readers into caring about injustices not just distant from themselves, but with which they might be complicit? And how then might the writer unveil this complicity while sparking a sense of solidarity that makes those readers want to change? Bearing in mind the strategic aims and perceived audiences of such translational texts of engagement, we can better see their displays of earnest investment in the evidentiary power of analogies and other forms of comparison as both performative and compensatory, a kind of poor theater. And that's where the selection ends. Poor theater, or theater that makes do with minimal resources, is an idea I take from Gugi Wationgo's use in Globalectics of Jerzy Grotowski's theatrical term, poor theater, to propose a post-colonialist poor theory. In dialogue with Gugi and with Virginia Woolf's utopian vision of a poor college, also animated by the idea of new imaginative possibilities arising out of minimal resources, the chapter turns to Woolf's feminist anti-war essay, 3 Guineas, and Aimé Césaire's discourse on colonialism, both polemical nonfiction essays that are also fictional addresses to powerful men who are already listening, when in fact no such dialogue has yet begun, and it's the task of the writing to usher in that dialogue. The chapter closes with a return to Danticat, whose traumatized protagonist in the testimonial novel, The Farming of Bones, expresses little hope of finding an audience at all, even as Danticat's own pattern of analogies between local and foreign fascisms and between local and distant atrocities press the reader to find connections and possibilities for action that the narrator herself may not be able to access. The chapter reads the persistent use of cross-cultural analogies to represent atrocity in all these texts as exemplifying a transnational poetic practice of making do with poor discursive resources in order to protest political violence, not necessarily invisible to a privileged readership, but typically beyond the reach of their sympathy and sense of responsibility. I begin with this close look at one chapter, the final chapter before the conclusion, because I want to illustrate how the disparate texts that I read comparatively in this book are themselves already structured around comparisons, often oblique and implicit, and characteristically stage contests of comparisons, that is, contests between imperialist or tyrannical modes of comparison, which tend to convey confidence in the hierarchy and permanence of social relations that a character or narrator seeks to defend, and more self-reflexive, inconclusive modes of comparison that in some measure haunt the hierarchical mode, admitting strange and fluctuating possibilities of relation and interpenetration, and admitting too, in varying degrees, the uncertainty and unease that attend encounters with social and cultural difference. As I discuss in my introduction, theorists such as Edouard Glissant, Ranajit Guha, Françoise Vergès, and Wendy Brown have variously identified the lurking anxiety that accompanies claims to mastery. They've shown how adversarial and racializing cultural rhetoric masks anxieties about disruptive relations and affirms a dominant community's familiar sense of itself. But what I'm calling anxious mastery in the book may be expressed as well through rhetorical forms that attenuate or refuse the satisfaction of reducing disconcerting relations and their transformative possibilities to a state of familiar divides. My book focuses on these more ambiguous, often implicit, and interpretively difficult literary forms that display rather than repress or purport to resolve the tensions, contradictions, and points of opacity that surface in encounters with otherness. Often these forms signify through implication rather than assertion, to convey what a speaker cannot say because it is unsayable in the familiar, circumscribed world of ideas and values that the speaker knows and perhaps wishes, at least ambivalently, to preserve. These indefinite and inconclusive forms of comparison and the characteristically unsettled and self-questioning worldviews they afford offer powerful means of countering presumptions of certainty about what is and is not one's domain, one's proper territory, both individually and communally. The book's focus is principally on writers in imperial, expatriate, and diasporic contexts who respond to newly expansive and insecure senses of community through literary forms of comparison that undermine territorialist justifications of social division and cultural hierarchy. The book offers a theory and critical analysis of oblique, indefinite, and self-reflexive forms of cultural comparison from the beginnings of transatlantic modernist literary experiments to post-colonial and creolist theoretical innovations in our present. Running through 20th and 21st century literature, literary and cultural theory, and historiography, these forms taken together constitute a critically neglected transnational poetics that characteristically evokes anxiety about the limits of acculturated knowledge and deploys that anxiety to challenge authoritative claims to intellectual and political mastery, especially European colonialist claims to cultural supremacy and rightful global dominance, but also humanist claims to supremacy over non-human animals, masculinist claims to supremacy over women, and ethno-nationalist claims to supremacy over immigrants, refugees, and people of color. The book's chapters are organized around pairings of early and late 20th century novels, poems, and essays by Gertrude Stein and J.M. Coetzee, T.S. Eliot and M.A. Césaire, E.M. Forster and Patrick Chamoiseau, and Virginia Woolf and Edwidge Danticat, with additional prose by Césaire, C.L.R. James, Edouard Glissant, Derek Walcott, Milan Kundera, and Ngugi wa Thiong'o also figuring significantly in the framing of these pairings. Read together, these texts suggest a turn, often subtle and more conflicted in earlier Atlantic modernist texts, while more overt and decisive in later diasporic and post-colonial texts, away from hierarchizing cultural comparisons and toward comparative practices marked by a questioning of one's home ground that admits rather than represses the anxiety that comes of a waning sense of mastery. By admitting this anxiety, these texts set in motion an imaginative process of overcoming the very structures and expectations of dominance that generate anxious mastery in the first place. I should add actually that they have the potential to set that imaginative process in motion. One of the things that I consider in the book in a variety of chapters is how that process, that setting in motion can be thwarted when critics translate these texts into more monologic and reductive messages about cultural politics, then I think their forms really support. But we can talk more about that. The comparative readings in the chapters point to a broadly and dynamically intercultural context of literary influence, of which authors may not even be aware. My comparisons, therefore, don't grow out of any text's direct reference to another or out of any evidence that one text directly influenced another. And I mean the principal literary texts here, the theorists and critics I discuss do often refer to each other. What matter to this study are convergent modes of representing encounters with alternate worldviews, modes whose convergence suggests affinities born of imperial legacies of stratification. Considering authorial influence as extending beyond individual writers' intentions and explicit frames of reference enables us to reconsider the extent to which literature is typically grouped in critical categories such as modernist, Africana, post-colonial, francophone, and global anglophone, for example, might relate and interpenetrate in ways those categories can obscure. This book proposes that comparative diasporic and especially Black francophone representational priorities intersect productively with those of Anglo-Atlantic modernist texts that foreground themes of cultural encounter and domination. Of particular methodological import to my argument have been the interpretive practices of Quayson, Gayatri Spivak, Ranajit Guha, Dipesh Chakrabarty, Michel Roth-Trouillot, and Patrick Chamoiseau, whose close readings of texts emphasize what escapes the colonial languages and conceptual structures of cultural imperialism that they have inherited and with which they must negotiate. Their negotiations with these constraints model methods of literary interpretation that suggest potential gains from openly acknowledging discrepancies between what languages can and cannot yet articulate. In tracing the politics of an argument or a story to the politics of its form, such methods of reading enable us to recognize in a variety of literary texts what Guha long ago implied in his ascription of latent anxiety to imperial discourse, namely, that the form of a text can qualify, even contradict, that text's manifest content and ostensible cultural politics. Hence, the political promise of a text may lie not simply or even mainly in its explicit conclusions, but in their interplay with textual modes of summoning forth what such conclusions sidestep or preclude. The highly self-reflexive comparative practices of these theorists and critics have prepared us to consider how and to what extent their own explicitly theorized and formally enacted difficulties in representing relations of difference converge with prior literary expressions of such difficulties. Of particular interest to modernism after postcolonialism are those poetics of relation, to borrow Glissant's famous term, that also use indeterminate figures and patterns of comparison in their pursuit of new collectivities beyond imperial and other exclusively defined regimes. My book argues that such uses of comparison arising out of disorienting and systemically unequal encounters in global modernity constitute a poetics that cuts across languages and empires. Recognizing them as such allows us to revisit some earlier 20th century Anglo-Atlantic modernist texts and to situate them within rather than outside a transnational comparatist literary project that Black Francophone theory has been indispensable in identifying. Revisiting texts whose difficult forms have been taken to reflect their authors' social and political elitism enables us to make better strategic use of their disorienting linguistic and conceptual resources, as well as those of more explicitly and consistently anti-imperialist writers whose comparative forms also cast light back on the significations of modernist aesthetics. My readings acknowledge the significant political, historical, and formal differences among these diverse texts and currents of thought. My goal is to accentuate their contributions to a compelling dream that has kept recurring since as early as Gertrude Stein's Three Lives first appeared in 1909, the dream of a newly self-critical representational language entangled with what it disputes, whose critical power is not to unveil the unfamiliar as if it could be made transparent, but to give form to interpretive and representational difficulties posed by encounters with difference within and across cultures. To evoke such encounters and the totalities of which they're part, without denying them their singular and untranslatable aspects, this language points to its own limitations, its own silences and absences. It conveys its inability to make sense of some experiences and perspectives, but also conveys enough about what is missing to induce readers to want to know more and to try to imagine more. In diverse formations of what Dipesh Chakrabarty has described as translucence, they offer us the possibility of imagining what is unspeakable within their own frames. They turn apparent absence into an elusive impression of presence. In summoning the unspeakable, these languages may or may not reflect their authors' manifest intentions or aspirations, but they share the effect of intimating that a world of known limits always coexists precariously with the possibility that, as Françoise Vergès puts it, the future is elsewhere. And I'll conclude with that and just compliment Laura that she zoomed in on that very important idea, important to me, Vergès's idea, the future is elsewhere, and which I develop in different ways in the book. So thank you for highlighting that, Laura. And thank you all for listening.
Can I just plug in with a completely absurd little promo here? Françoise Vergès is actually going to be speaking at the Center for European Studies on October 13th.
Oh, great.
In conversation with R.A. Judy. And our event will be called, it's called Reactivating Internationalism, Thinking Toward a Revolutionary Peace. So I will send you the link and I hope you'll join us. It's October 13th, 11 a.m. So, and Françoise is fabulous. So we're hoping to get her out here in person as well. Maybe we can talk about that later. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
That's very exciting.
I didn't want to forget. So I just thought that it was just the right pairing with.
Absolutely, yeah, thank you. That's great.
And now we're looking for Ato's response.
So Mara, thank you very much for this provocative book, because the book is full of provocations in the sense that it is multi-generative of more ideas. So it doesn't settle anything. It provokes more thinking. And this is the spirit in which I read it and in which I'm going to try and shape my remarks. Now, if I understand it correctly, no, well, I do understand. I'm going to tell you what I understand, and then, of course, you can refute my understanding as you wish. The book centers on, or at least that's how it opens in the introduction, on the question of difficulty, of indeterminacy, of elusiveness, and so on, staged via modernist discourse, Virginia Woolf and others. But the indeterminacy is then taken as, shall we call it, a procedural trope, procedural literary trope, and shown to also be found in certain postcolonial texts, Coetzee and Césaire. In other words, difficulty is not just a modernist procedural trope, but it's also found in postcolonial texts of both the Francophone and Anglophone traditions. So that's one. But the second thing is that this formal device, which is the device of indeterminacy and difficulty, is pointing at something else. And what it is pointing to is the encounter with otherness of different kinds. And the encounter generates a problem of shall we, for lack of a better word, containment or representation. And so the indeterminacy and the difficulty are signs of this problematic, as we might say. But not only that, the indeterminacy and difficulty are also a pointer to the contestation of hegemonic discourse, because hegemonic discourse or discourses want to establish a clear relationship between signifier and signified. between the naming and the named. In other words, to translate a complex world into a domain of manageability or management. So this is how I understand it, that the difficulty that we see, the literary difficulties, as to be interpreted as a sign not just of the encounter with a problematic encounter with otherness, but also a sign of the contestation of hegemonic modes of, call them imperial or colonial. And she uses different terms. One, and I'm going to pose, these are comments, questions. One implication of the way the text is structured, from Stein to Coetzee, from Eliot to Césaire, is that there is a kind of teleology in the, not evolution, because she's not talking in an evolutionary sense, but in terms of the replication of difficulty. So she sets it up in such a way that the grounds of the perception initially is modernism. And there's nothing wrong with that, because the modernists are well known to make a value of aporia, difficulty, and so on. But because she does, so she does Stein and Coetzee, Eliot and Césaire, this and that, it gives the implication is that without the modernists, we cannot comprehend postcolonial difficulty. That is to say, so my question is, could she have written this book without a reference to the modernists at all? So that's question number one. What if she had written it without, as it were, the space clearing gesture of evoking the modernists? Do postcolonialists not deploy devices of difficulty in relation to problems that have nothing to do, because of course the modernist universe is completely different from the postcolonial universe. I think she will disagree with that, Mara will disagree with me, but my question is, could we not have raised the question of difficulty without touching on or first invoking the modernists? So that's my first question. My second has to do with, and it's a similar question, but I'm rooting it through a reading of Coetzee, of Disgrace. Now, and I really enjoyed your interpretation of Disgrace, but let's say, add something else or append something else. Now, Disgrace, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is the only text of Coetzee's, of all his novels, that has to confront the burden of history. The Life and Times of Michael K. doesn't have the same historical burden. Waiting for the Barbarians does not have the same historical burden. Slow Man does not have the same historical burden. But what do I mean by historical burden? Disgrace is primarily about truth and reconciliation. And reparation, as it were, but in the specific context of South Africa. But this burden of history, which is South African history, is undone by a particular device of opacity. Let's go back to this question of opacity that Coetzee replicates in all his work, which is centering a hero, because they're normally men, who are self-revisionary. That is to say, they are always afflicted by second thoughts. So one of the key features of the central character of David is that he's always making his mind and withdrawing his own propositions inside his own head. So he's not talking to anybody. He's thinking and revising the proposal. You see the same thing with the magistrate in Waiting for the Barbarians. It repeatedly, his characters are self-revisionary. The propositions are automatically undone by a series of doubts. So that's where the difficulty comes from. But because of this self-revision, the main confrontation with history, which is the question of TRC, Truth and Reconciliation in South Africa, is as it were, is dissolved. Is dissolved in this multiple position making and self-revision and so on. So that in other words, he as it were, he said the text sidesteps the question. It poses the question, what ought a white person to do in the face of the blatant rape of the country, which is now symptomatized as a literary example of the rape of his daughter? But what is the responsibility of a white South African in the face of the historical rape, which is now symptomatized as the rape of David Lurie's daughter? So he poses this question, but actually avoids answering it. And the avoidance is generated from this replication of a particular device that he has throughout his books, which is a character who cannot make up their mind. It's not that they cannot make up their mind, but they're self-revisionary. So fundamentally, they are struck by ambivalence and self-revision. So that's the one thing. So then my question in relation to this is, what do you think Coetzee does with history in Disgrace? In relation to this is something else that you mentioned, which is actually a central principle undergirding your entire text, is the non-territorial comparison. Because you make an argument for not limiting or locking these individual texts into particular territories so that you free them to be able to compare them transnationally across different terrains. My question, this third question flows from the Coetzee one, which is, what do you do with the fact that this text, and in fact, all the other texts that you deal with proliferate specific geographical and spatial markers? That is to say, you cannot read Disgrace and think that it was written by a Japanese or a Nigerian. It is impossible because it proliferates too many geographical details that make you, that will not permit you to mistake it even for another African country. So what do you do with the non-territorial principle? When these, and what I'm saying applies not just to Coetzee, I'm just taking Coetzee because that's where I'm at, but all the other texts, what do you do with the principle of non-territoriality, trying to separate the text from territory, when internal to the text self-recognition are numerous territorial markers? How do you attend to your larger methodological impulse? The final thing is, as I was reading the book, I was thinking there are quite a few, thinking in terms of intellectual history, but separated from the modernist intellectual history, of which there's a plethora of examples, but more from a post-colonial context. There are quite a few other writers, post-colonial critics, who have dealt with the conjoined questions of difficulty and also comparison. So the question of comparison and difficulty, so for example, Natalie Mellas, you mentioned Natalie Mellas in the book, All the Difference in the World. But you mentioned Natalie Mellas in order to illustrate her opinion on a text that you are also talking about. You don't actually engage with her model of comparison, because in Natalie Mellas is doing something similar, or she's wrestling with a similar problem to yours, which is how do we compare between non-commensurate texts from different parts of the world? The same with well, Melas you are familiar with, obviously, because you cite her. Nicholas Thomas in Utopian Generations also does something very similar. He also pairs, his is also modernism and postcolonialism. The modernist text and certain primarily African text, but not exclusively. But his model is more Marxist inflected. So he's more interested in the material domain and the representations of material transformations and so on. Anjali Prabhu's hybridity. You mentioned Anjali Prabhu, but in association with Adlai Murdoch on métissage. But actually, Prabhu has a whole book on hybridity. She has a fantastic chapter on glissant, which echoes yours in a variety of respects. I know that you invoke Francois Vergès and Francois Lyonnais several times. My question now is, what do you think, how do you think your book fits into a whole intellectual historical tradition in postcolonial studies? So not because your book can be made to, it is genus-based. It can be made to look at modernist debates, but it can also be made to look at postcolonial debates. My interest is in the postcolonial part of it. What kind of as it were, intellectual history are you participating in? So postcolonial intellectual history around the question of métissage, hybridity, and so on, as well as comparison. In fact, the comparison question is a really big one because it's a big problem, how to compare. I was teaching my first class in African literature yesterday. And I tried to impress on my students that, and we started with Achebe's Things Fall Apart. And I told them that, first of all, my class is not an anthropology class. When you come to my class, don't expect to know anything about the African mind. That's not my business. But more importantly, you must read the books that I introduce you to as portals to understanding literature in general. So you are reading Things Fall Apart, but I want you to think of Sophocles at the same time, and Shakespeare, and any number of other writers. That's so what you're reading. And the example I gave them was actually, I didn't give them, I gave you a different example, but what I'm going to exemplify on Thursday, which is the second class, is the moment when Okonkwo kills the messenger, and how the entire description adopts a very elemental quality, so the background freezes and it's as if anything can happen. That elementalism, you can see it in any number of texts in both the postcolonial and various other traditions, so that what we're looking at is postcolonial literature as a gateway to other problems, or literary problems in general, and so on. So my final question then, I've lost track of my phone, but I'm going to make up one up anyway, is the if we're thinking of a contribution to postcolonial intellectual history, who would you be your primary interlocutors, and how would you see yourself as inserting yourself into this intellectual history? But thank you for a great and provocative, highly generative book.
Thank you. That's really, those are just such amazing questions. And I think I have either 4 or 5. I think the last one that you said was separate. To my mind, that probably is connected to what I imagined before, but you can correct me as I talk. But Laura, should I just respond now, or is that?
Yes, go ahead and respond. And I do have a few questions coming in that I'll and others who want to, weigh in with questions, please do. And I'll present those tomorrow.
Okay, that's great. These are such rich, close readings, Otto. Thank you. So I'll try to take these in order, I guess. So yeah, the first question, could this get you say that there seems to be possibly a kind of teleology implied by the structure of Stein, Coetzee, Eliot, Césaire, and it's true that in the index, in the titles, the earlier writer is listed first, and it's true that the book is structured in a way that that takes the earliest modern transatlantic modernist text, the three lives by Stein, and then moves chronologically from Stein to Eliot to Forster to Woolf. They were contemporaries, but looking at, so there is a certain ordering by chronology there, although I wasn't thinking of it that way because, and I know that the rest of your question is that, let's see, could we not have raised, could I have addressed the problem of difficulty and some of the related issues that you rightly connected to that? Could we not have done that without reference, or could we have done that without reference to the transatlantic modernist writers, and what would that have looked like? I think that was the question, and I guess I would, in some ways, bring that together with the fourth question, which had to do with other important post-colonial critics. What is the difference between my work and theirs, or what am I doing differently? I mean, it does seem to me that centrally what I'm trying to do here is argue that as readers of certain transatlantic modernist texts that have been seen, I think, among many critics since the 90s, some of whom identify as post-colonial critics, some of whom identify as, in other areas, to see some of these texts like The Wasteland, Melanctha by Stein, to some extent A Passage to India, as really just irreparably dated because of their cultural politics. And usually what gets quoted is, certain lines or certain very commonplace readings of those texts that reduce them, in my view, to a certain core message. And I don't deny that there are all kinds of ways that these texts are radically different from the other texts with which I compare them, and from the politics that I myself see myself as having and promoting through these readings. But part of what I see as different in my work from Molass's and Prabhu's and Vergèse's and Brown's, Nicholas Brown's, is that I don't see those critics as particularly focused on early 20th century or interwar English language canonical literature. I just don't, Molass discusses Conrad, but mostly she's focused on Caribbean literature, and and in that in all the difference in the world. Brown has a Marxist, my remembrance of it's been a while. I got out the Brown just when you mentioned it, but my memory of him is that he's committed to a Marxist approach to reading African literature. I don't remember him as particularly interested in people like Eliot or Woolf. And so, what happens then is there is a divide. This is another kind of territorialism that concerns me, that you have and this gets to Laura's interest in disciplines and disciplinarity in her seminar. I mean, if all of these, exceptional, insightful post-colonial critics don't think it's worth revisiting, say, The Wasteland, then—
Sorry to interrupt. In Brown's
Yeah.
case, it's not entirely accurate. He's heavily invested in the modernists just there.
Okay.
They all are in different
Well,
ways.
yeah, sure.
But you are more systematic. There's no doubt about it. You're more systematic in the way you set things, but they all are in a variety, except for Prabhu, because Prabhu, I mentioned her because of métissage problem, but the others are.
Right. Yeah. I mean,
You're
probably I really have drawn on, and I probably should have engaged more with that book on hybridity, which is, I mean, her work on Glisson and Fanon. I mean, she's really, just, been very illuminating for me. But yeah, looking at Brown, I see that, yeah, he does. But I just remember, I mean, I remember him as having a different set of critical affiliations. I mean, again, I could be, it's been a while since I looked at him, but I mean, I don't remember him as interested in people like Spivak and Chakrabarty, and the kind of convergence of subaltern studies, intellectuals, Asian diasporic intellectuals, who and Francophone theorists like Glisson and Vergès and Chamoiseau. I mean, my thing is bringing these together, and I just don't think that those two groups, the subaltern studies thinkers, who the thinkers who originally were part of that collective, who went on to theorize opacity and translucence in such productive ways, and the Francophone, mostly African diasporic and Caribbean diasporic intellectuals, who have theorized relation and opacity in their ways. I just didn't see them really brought together, and I certainly didn't see them brought together and their ideas of difficulty brought together with those of some of these earlier thinkers. And the problem with that is, I mean, one problem is that if you don't have, say, Eliot thought about, in a really, in a way that doubts some of the core assumptions about, how he was read by the new critics. I mean, not that they were wrong, it's just that it's one way. And if you start with the idea that what The Wasteland is saying, what the message is, then, and it's not worthy of discussing if you're, a more politically enlightened post-colonial critic, then it's going to be left to critics who really, in my view, aren't as politically enlightened, to keep perpetuating that reading. So for one thing, I wanted to do for my interlocutors in post-colonial studies was maybe give them some incentive to take more seriously some of these earlier texts, notwithstanding, the many differences between their the stated cultural politics of their authors, and historical uses of some of these texts. That's I think I started with question one and kind of shifted to question four.
May I, Mara, just interject that we do have one question just as a follow-up I wanted to ask was if you aimed to also redefine modernism through these comparisons. In a sense, it is a critique of the field of modernism that forces modernism in these new directions. I mean, and then I know Sadi has a question. So just as you're circling back to the one on history, I wanted to also let you know that one of my students raised the question, a very practical question about this idea of teleology. Do you think that political or colonial dominance is less now than before?
Do I think that political could you say it again?
or colonial dominance is less now than before? That's one question that I hope you can keep in mind as you think about history in Coetzee in response to Otto. And then I know also Saudi has a question. So would you like to pose your question, Saudi, and then we can kind of circle back tomorrow for some more answers?
Sure. I mean, my question is actually sort of a version of yours, Laura, but it's a question that's I think both to Mara and to Otto's response as well, right? Because I'm interested in the distinction between the modernist and the post-colonial, and this, and I have to say, and whether that distinction holds in all cases. What is actually the distinction? And part of that was, even before I went into this, I was going to, and I have to just say beforehand, I haven't read the book yet, and I'm planning to, because I'm working on some writers who are, I guess, modernist and post-colonial, right? I mean, an Urdu writer who's very important to me, Orotlan Heather, who I think is lamentably underread, even though she sort of translated herself, or she called one of them a transcreation, and I'm trying to think through what that means. But, and also some Greek modernist writers, right, who I think are certainly part of a certain kind of gray area of what constitutes the colonial and what doesn't. But going into this, my question was, because I've just written a very long chapter on Walcott and ruins. And so Melas is also on my mind, and actually have a disagreement with Melas about Walcott, a deep disagreement. But is Walcott a modernist? I mean, is he not? What is he? Is he, and alongside, I mean, he's post-colonial, we know that, right? I have no problem calling Orotlan Heather a modernist for all kinds of reasons. I mean, literary technique, form, and so on. And the fact that she very interestingly, in her novel Al-Qadariya, which is literally translates as River of Fire, and that she transcreated as River of Fire, has a translation from the four quartets in the Urdu. She translates it into Urdu as the epigraph, and then leaves the epigraph off in her transcreation. There's no Eliot, okay? And then when she's asked by Kumkum Samgari what happened to Eliot in the English, she says in Urdu, and I'm going to try to translate this, but I have to say it myself in Urdu to kind of chud gaya hoga, which is untranslatable, because it's and I was thinking about this last night, because I was trying to think, how would I translate this even in my chapter? It's like saying it must have gotten left, but it's like the only way I have of translating it effectively is like, when a child's holding your hand and it gets accidentally released on either side. So it's almost like the Eliot dropped like a child's hand, okay? Or an adult's hand for that matter, right? So she says Turgelga, and that's her only response to Sangari on this, right? Mm-hmm. And so part of the question, I guess, that I'm getting at from different angles is, because I'm very interested in the question also of the spatial as opposed to the territorial, right? I mean, I think that there's a kind of implicit in Otto's question was also this notion of the relationship between the spatial and the territorial, because they're not the same, of course, right? And you can be fully nationally, or you can be embedded in a space without being territorial, and you can. And I've begun to think of the colonial moment, even in the Americas, as a kind of re-territorialization of the European problematics, right? That if you think of what Protestantism and Catholicism are doing in Lusophones, Hispanophone, and then Anglophone America is duking out a Reformation debate, which gets re-territorialized in the colonial formation. So I'm throwing a lot at you because I didn't get to write notes like Otto and systematize them. But what I'm saying is, right, that there's, I'm also pushing a little, toying a little with Otto's formulation, because I don't know what the distinction is between the post-colonial and the modernist, right? Mm-hmm. Because I refuse to concede that the modernist white writer is outside the domain of colonialism. Right? I mean, in a full form. So does that mean So then how do we read that? I mean, is there a post-colonial reading of the modernist? Or is it that we've got to rethink both the post-colonial and the modernist as within the domain of the question of colonialism? And that gets to Laura's our students' very practical question. Is it more or less now? And of course it isn't less. I mean, Afghanistan just goddamn happened and it's still happening, right?
Right.
So maybe it's a reformulation. Maybe it's an opaque reformulation of colonial problematic, but we're still there. So, you know, there are questions in there, and maybe you can experience this as a kind of morass as well. But I think that's what I'm thinking through here, right? That I don't even like the form global modernism or vernacular modernism, right? But then I also wonder what the post-colonial is, because we're still living empire.
Yeah.
Right? There's no exit from this domain, right? So it seems to me post-colonial studies has dropped the ball too, and it's attempted differentiation, right? I mean, if the question is truth and reconciliation, the question is, but first we have to acknowledge, right, what it is that we're trying to reconcile. And I don't think we know fully. I mean, I think post-colonial studies is actually at a kind of problematic moment too, where we don't fully know right now what it is that we're trying to, with all due respect to my colleagues, right? What are we trying to do? So I guess that's the question. What are we trying to do? If that's a question, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many great questions here. I mean, let me, I mean, a number of these interrelated, and I'll see if I can kind of address a few of these. I mean, going back to your student's question, Laura, are the are the political is the politics of colonial dominance less than before? I mean, I think that you know, my very I think that's a really great question, because that helps to throw in relief really why it pushes me to explain why one of the reasons I'm putting some of these colonial, you know, these European colonial era texts that are often seen as you know, kind of just benighted in their in terms of either their depiction or their authors' references to you know, race or ethnic difference, or colonialism itself. I mean, the reason that I'm bringing these together with 90s, really 1990s era literary texts, and learning from what these 1990s era literary texts by Coetzee and Danticat and Chamoiseau and you know, and Walcott, learning from what they have to teach us about earlier forms of domination and, you know, imperial and global domination. That's because it does persist, right? As Sadia is also pointing to, you know, I think that is one of the justifications for understanding all of these texts as needing to keep pushing us to be doubtful of you know, easy answers, transparent claims that you know, seem to divide off, you know, one era from another, or seem to divide off one population from another, one community from another, one discipline from another. And that takes me back to this idea of territorialism. I mean, I probably should have included this in the paper, but the territoriality that worries me isn't only geographic territoriality. It's also disciplinary. I mean, let me just quickly read this definition that I have of non-territorial. By non-territorial, I do not mean extraterritorial, a precise designation in international law for conditions in which a state's legal jurisdiction extends beyond its own territorial borders. Extraterritoriality, and then I say a little bit about that. Then I say non-territorial is deliberately inchoate. It identifies what it resists being, but it will not specify and delimit what the contrary is and should be, as if there were a binary choice. An adjective, not a noun, a shifting modifier, not a determinate thing. Non-territorial clearly opposes territorial in both its associated senses of proprietary and bound by or restricted to a particular territory, but its prefix non leaves open how to imagine what the not territorial could be at different times in different contexts. Non-territorial comparatist reading does not seek to resolve textual difficulties into a reassuring state of coherence. Rather, it seeks to recognize these difficulties as at once informed by their author's immediate contexts and affiliations and potentially transformed by their conjunctures with other textual forms in variable but also overlapping fields of cultural knowledge. So, I mean, I go on about that, but I'm trying to get at the idea of one's domain. When people feel, either individuals or authors or groups feel, this is what I know, this is what's familiar to me, and it's what I know, and I've got it figured out. And that's where the value of languages, literary languages, poetics, call them what you want, that is the value of literary languages, just putting on display kind of self-contradiction and unease, and they, you know, they do this in varying forms of explicitness, but that's what I'm getting at with the territorial. I mean,
and that does relate to that kind of self-reflexive question about what the post-colonial is doing now. I mean, sort of opening that up. Yeah. We did have one other question. I think it's an interesting one about your reference to not just a poor college, maybe it's an allusion to, you know, public universities as opposed to private ones. But the question came from my student, you know, what would if poor theory you described there, what would rich theory look like? Or what would that be, rich theory? Is that a limited theory in some way, and in what ways?
Yeah, I think Ngugi wa Thiong'o proposes poor theory as a kind of, and then I take that term and I use it, I think, the way that he means it, which is to say theory that is learning from the non-dominant. And that's really, I mean, this takes it back to this question of whether the relationship between transatlantic modernism, I won't call that all of modernism, because the word modernism, as this discussion has made clear, has shifted and changed, and it means different things to so many people, which is why I have a lot of definitional stuff in the book. But I usually, my way of dealing with that is to modify the modernism that I'm talking about. So if I'm talking about European modernism or, you know, interwar modernism, transatlantic modernism, that's what I'll usually just modify it rather than call it modernism as such. Sorry, I'm just trying to, Laura, what was my?
So then I guess, I mean, we got this great question coming from my students saying, you know, what would this rich and resourceful method be? And would it be precisely that theory that refuses to learn from the non-dominant? Is it that sort of self-satisfied, a historic, I mean, how would you define that?
Yeah, I think that's what he's, I mean, he starts out by discussing poor theater, which isn't his coinage, but it's he discusses this theatrical concept in relation to his own theatrical practice as a playwright, and he just emphasizes that he and his actors didn't, and fellow, you know, theater people just didn't have a lot of resources, but that there are certain gains to be, you know, experienced by adapting and making do with these limited resources. You end up in a different place, a different imaginative place, a different, way of a different way of producing, a different what your art is, and a different way of thinking about your art and thinking about other people's art. If it's coming from this place that is decidedly not privileged. And so I think he's saying that theory that is, that is not, and let me say that he's not necessarily opposed to established theorists. He cites Gayatri Spivak, for example, in an admiring way. And he raises up post-colonial theory and criticism in general as what we need to continue to learn from. And, I think that this is really valuable and an important goal of my book too, because there is in modernist studies, and now this takes me to a different field that, we haven't talked about so much, but, in transatlant, in so-called modernist studies, the new modernist studies, there is this sense among many of us who work in with post-colonial theory and sort of theory and criticism, especially from the 90s and since, that was really working through problems of European colonialism. There's this sense that a lot of people see themselves as having moved on from post-colonial studies that they never fully learned from. And what they didn't really learn was to take seriously unequal distributions of resources and and precisely this idea of learning from the non-dominant in whatever, in whatever way that, that may mean to the critic. But, so this idea of global modernism or global modernist studies became really dominant. And there's all this comparison going on, especially among Anglophone texts, but there's not as much interest in Francophone, Anglophone or Anglophone connections to other languages as I think would be good for the field. And there's also just not much of an engagement many times with what I think are some of the most valuable insights of post-colonial theory. And so that's it's an intervention in modernism studies, because I see myself as learning from post-colonial theorists and writers. In a way, it's hard for me to, it's hard for me to, I don't know, it requires that I reorient myself when Otto says, why are you not engaging more with these people? Because they are so much, I see them so much as guides, but it's true, I could explicitly work more with more of them, but the ones that end up really taking center stage in the book are a number of Francophone writers and Spivak and some of these other, in Chakrabarty. So, but I could easily have expanded it.
Maura, let me just add also Hispanophone modernism. I mean, that's sort of my own area. And then I don't know, I do want to ask Maura where you're going to go next. What's your next project? If you do want to talk about that, but I know Otto also has a question.
So I just wanted to say, Maura, please don't get me wrong. It is not working with them that is, for me, actually interesting, but it's to distinguish yourself from what they are doing explicitly. Because that's what I think is the stakes of post-colonial literary history. Is not just for us to work with, but to work against, to distinguish. So for example, making an explicit distinction between what you are doing and what Melas is doing, or what Brown is doing, and Artivadi, the listed. Because that distinction, because you are right, none of them is really interested in Francophone, not that much. But before you make that distinction, you would have had to explain what you thought they were doing. And that in itself would be extremely valuable. So you don't need to actually work with them or even agree with them, but distinguish yourself from them. And that then establishes a tradition that people then can go to. Is okay, Mara, this is what she did, this is what Natalie Mellers did, and this is the difference, and what can we, so it's not to
I mean,
work.
one thing I'll add about Mellers is that, I mean, she is working more on Anglophone and Francophone Caribbean plus Conrad, as I recall, but she also is, and again, this is just my recollection, she's interested in, I mean, there is some overlap in that she's interested in these incommensurable, I think she's more interested in the idea in the idea of incommensurability than I am. One of the things that I see myself as, and I do have a part where I mean, I don't hold her up as one of the people I'm specifically contesting, because she does it she discusses incommensurability in a way that I really liked and don't object to, and there are people that I resist more in this. But what makes me nervous, as you can tell from my argument, I think is when critics say, well, you can't really compare those, that's not a legitimate comparison, or that's not, or you can make the comparison, but there's going to be this clear hierarchy. It's just either it's no longer, it's not going to be that the European is superior. It's going to be that the Caribbean person is superior. It's just, I don't like these kinds of very divisive territorial ways of talking about this. But what Mellers does is she discusses incommensurable forms in that were developed, but I think the lesson of that is that comparative literature can learn from these enactments, these literary enactments of incommensurability, and that does seem to me quite different from my focus on affinities in surrounding kind of inconclusive comparative forms. I mean, yes, they're inconclusive, and you could say that it's leaving a kind of mystery or set of mysteries, and she's interested in mysteries of a sort too, relating to incommensurability. But I'm looking at patterns that authors who don't seem to be very much alike might share. So it's and where to go with. You also asked about where's history in this. I think that it wouldn't be interesting to me to leave it with the idea that they have these patterns in common. I mean, I think I spend, depending on the chapter, but for example, in the Stein-Coetzee chapter, I think I discuss Stein on her own terms in terms of what was going on when she was writing this, in terms of racial theory, right? And blood politics, sort of this, I'm just blanking on the word, but that's not at all the context in which Coetzee is writing about race. And so I think I lay those things out, but so I think history is crucial for this, because you need to acknowledge the differences, but see how something how a comparative form or a strategy of comparison can cross over, right? How it can cross from one very specific historical and discursive context to another.
I should actually say very quickly that I have I wasn't pushing against the non-territoriality. I actually love that about the project, right? I mean, I think that's a kind of interesting way of putting it, right? But I do, those questions I was posing, and again, I say that I still kind of hang on to the notion of post-colonial as well. I mean, I still think it's fruitful, right? But I just I'm more and more frustrated by the circumscription of the domains on either side, right? Yeah. So I'm reading Walcott, but I'm following, Walcott has led me to Faulkner, for instance.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm now writing a chapter of Faulkner, right?
Yeah.
In a book that started out about Greece and North, and then it was also about Greece and India, right? In some ways. So, but the point is, that's one thing on the one hand. On the other hand, it's also taken me back to T.S. Eliot's engagement with the Southern agrarians, right? Because you can't think about the New Critics or Eliot without actually thinking about the engagement with the American South and all the reading that I've been doing at the moment, right? And so does that make me post-colonial or not? Frankly, I don't care. I mean, it's a colonial world. Let's figure it out, and then I'll go from there, right? So in some sense, I've also found a certain engagement with the question of self-replication within the profession less and less methodologically interesting.
Yeah.
Because I'm more and more interested in following the question and see, or following the text and see where it takes me. And it's taken me in very strange places in the last 5 years, right? I mean, this new book is crazy, right?
Yeah, and Lisa, well, I mean, I think that's great. That's exactly what I am hoping to see more of, because I too have been really kind of impatient with some of these divisions. And this, of course, is not true of I mean, Otto is right that it's not true of, it's certainly not true of Otto's work, and it's not true of the work of some of our, best critics now. But I do think there's a kind of persistent dividing up into fields, and but I agree that the terms, I mean, one reason I didn't spend a lot of time in the book, getting into debates over whether the term modernism should be used for this or that, group of people, is that it wasn't, I'm not mainly interested in the term. I mean, that's why I usually modify it to explain what I'm talking about. I'm not convinced. I mean, some of you may know, one of the debates about this circles around Susan Stanford Friedman's sort of claim in Planetary Modernisms that, modernities and their aesthetic production, which she calls modernisms, that these are, you can find these pre-1500, you can find these with, the Mongol Empire, you can find these in the Tongsung dynasties, you can find these all over the place. But it, and her whole point is that it's Eurocentric to, to claim modernism, just for one, one time and place or cultural formation. But, I mean, I'm happy to have it. I don't need it to be limited, but I also think that the term still needs to be useful. And if we apply it to too many things, then, then that can also seem problematically expansionist. I mean, I know that some people really object to the way that so many texts are kind of lumped together with other things in modernism, with the term modernism put under the umbrella of modernism. In my case, I wasn't so interested in looking at multiple separate modernisms. I was interested in tracking what I saw as a particular transnational modernist project. And yeah, I guess I treat that as still continuing and as including the writing of Spivak and Chakrabarty and Glisson and a number of people who are developing and imagining and reimagining ideas of this language that is self-critical and self-reflexive and difficult.
So maybe on that note, we can just thank Ideas and Futures, thank Otto Quayson, thank Mara for this conversation, and thank you to all of our participants for your questions.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone who asked a question. And Otto, these are just, I took very careful notes. I'm going to be thinking about all of these questions and comments for a long time. And and Laura, I didn't get back to the next project, but we'll talk about that.
Yeah, and there are a few other questions that I'll forward to you from some other great students.
We ran out of time.
Mara. Thank you, Sadia.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, also. All right.
Thank you, Laura, for wonderful organizing and putting together this wonderful event. Ideas and Futures is very grateful to all three of you. We do look forward to getting more conversations. If you want to propose one, we'd love to put it up. And so, have more of this. We're going to stop the recording now, but we will continue to chat for a moment.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.